In April of 2013, the games industry lost one of the most imaginative developers of the 80s and 90s, LucasArts. Known for their adventure games, and then during the last decade for shoveling licensed Star Wars drivel onto every platform imaginable, LucasArts redefined the adventure game genre and had a generation of kids and gamers methodically clicking on items in their inventory and using them with every square pixel of screen real estate, until using thing with other thing yielded the desired results.
LucasArts' closing has had a profound impact on me. Games like Monkey Island and Zak McKracken were an integral part of my childhood. My first exposure to Indiana Jones was through the 2 video game adaptations of The Last Crusade put out for the Amiga, and though the action game wasn't entertaining enough, it was the more cerebral adventure game that held my interest, probably because by that point I'd already played and fallen in love with The Secret of Monkey Island.
Monkey Island has a very special place in my heart. I was very young when it came out, and I'd watch my cousin Andy playing through it on our Amiga. I was captivated by the characters and the imagery and the locations, but I couldn't read, so I didn't know what was happening myself. So I learned to read. I learned to read so I could play through Monkey Island, and in doing so, I fell in love with the game all over again. Monkey Island is probably one of the most formative video game experiences for me as a kid, and it really defined what I want from a video game and my sense of humour. And it's very special to me. Arguably, you know, as the way that a lot of geeks my age kind of revere Star Wars, that's how I feel about Monkey Island. It's very important to me.
And so the rest of the genre became important to me. King's Quest and Space Quest were constant go-to games, even though I kept dying and to this day haven't finished a game in either series, and Adventuresoft's Simon the Sorcerer perfectly captured that same lightning in a bottle that Monkey Island had done years prior. Beneath a Steel Sky is, I firmly believe, one of the greatest games of all time, and more recently Telltale's efforts with Sam & Max, Strong Bad's Cool Game for Attractive People, and fittingly Tales of Monkey Island have done a decent enough job of providing my fix of humorous lateral thinking games.
But it's a genre that started with LucasArts, or at least was redefined by their efforts. And thankfully, there are enough odd ports of LucasArts adventure games for us to draw upon that we can make a full episode of this shit for you. Aren't you lucky? So let's start in an unlikely but familiar place.
Maniac Mansion was originally released on the Commodore 64 in 1987, then gradually trickled out to other systems over the course of the next 3 years. In this game, the player controls 3 characters as they explore a mansion, rescue a girlfriend, and sort of save the world a bit.
Which is as good a way of earning brownie points with your girlfriend as any, I suppose.
In 1990, the game was ported to the NES, but it wasn't just a simple case of use game with console. The entire game had to be rebuilt from the ground up, the graphics redrawn to fit the NES system limitations and screen geometry, and original music composed to fill in the dead air.
It's a bit weird playing Maniac Mansion on an NES, if only because the game really screams out for a mouse, but it's a bit like watching the 1998 remake of Psycho. Yes, it's basically the same game, but it looks wrong and feels a little soulless and without character. In the case of Psycho 98, it's because it's shit, but in the case of Maniac Mansion, it's because of Nintendo.
At the time, Nintendo had exceptionally strict restrictions with regards to content in games for their console. Nudity and sexual references had to be stripped out of the game, transforming Nurse Edna from a saucy filthmonger into a delicate-mouthed worrywart, and removing some art in the game, including a statue that Nintendo insisted had pubic hair, but didn't. Violence wasn't allowed, which was a bit rich from a company whose biggest hit was a game about a fat plumber maliciously jumping on turtles, and while there wasn't much violence in Maniac Mansion, there were references that Nintendo deemed violent, and so these too had to be stripped out. Though you can still put a hamster in a microwave, because hamsters aren't people.
In fact, much of the content had to be gutted, which completely alters the tone of the game. Despite the survival of some hilarious moments, the B-movie comedy feel is completely diminished thanks to the cuts demanded by Nintendo. You can find a complete breakdown of the changes and cuts made to the game on the website of former LucasArts employee Douglas Crawford.
But how does it play? Well, aside from the odd-looking graphics and the NES controller serving as a woefully inefficient means of controlling a point-and-click adventure, it's basically the same game. It just doesn't have the same feel, doesn't evoke the same emotional response that playing the original does.
I suppose that's down to having played one of the superior versions of the game as a kid. If I'd grown up playing the NES version, perhaps I'd feel differently. But I'm finding it hard to set aside my emotional bias on this one. I mean, I'm not about to have any LucasArts employees killed or anything, but in fairness, that is because Disney more or less took care of that one for me.
The amazing things about the LucasArts archives is that it took someone like me who doesn't really play video games and made them accessible. You had X-Wing and TIE Fighter, where you can actually go in and pilot, and not that I'm learning real pilot skills, but it was something that was engaging to me. With the same principle, you have games like Day of the Tentacle and Sam & Max, where I have no interest in problem solving or thinking while playing video games, but it made it so much fun to play because the characters like Sam and Max in particular were so ridiculous. It's like, I can't use these things together. The voices were hilarious. You're invested in the characters and you care what happens to them. I think I've only ever beaten like maybe 4 games in my whole life because I don't care. And Day of the Tentacle is one of them. I think Sam and Max is one of them as well. I might have even beat Rebel Assault. Because, you know, I wanted to be Luke Skywalker when I was a kid.
Maniac Mansion was only LucasArts' first attempt at porting one of their adventure games to a console. 3 years later, they'd have a go again with a port of The Secret of Monkey Island for the Sega Mega CD.
The first entry in the Monkey Island series is the one where LucasArts nailed their adventure game formula. There were no dead ends, almost no unwinnable situations save for an in-joke and a rare scenario that would require the player to use every single one of their pieces of 8 in a vending machine, and it doesn't punish the player for trying to do something stupid. Or sensible, for that matter.
LucasArts' adventure gaming rival Sierra had a knack of punishing the player for exploring the game world and experimenting within the game, and that's something that Monkey Island designers Ron Gilbert, Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman wanted to actively avoid by encouraging the player to explore the world and talk to secondary characters. And this is why Sierra went bust years ago, while Monkey Island developers LucasArts are still...
Monkey Island was originally released for numerous home computers in 1990 and found its way onto the Mega CD in 1993. Released exclusively in North America and Japan, the game's transition to Sega's ill-fated accessory is... well, it's not great. It's easily the worst looking version of the game, with dark, muddy colours and visual cuts. It also suffers from severe slowdowns in some rooms such as the Scum Bar, has missing content such as Guybrush's drowning death and the alternate endings, and suffers from some abominable loading times. Oh, and you can't save your game.
Rather than make use of the Mega CD's internal RAM storage, Monkey Island instead relies on a password system. Whenever you pause the game, it shows you a 4-character password that basically serves as a bookmark for how much progress you've made in the game. The problem is it doesn't keep track of your inventory items or which characters you've had conversations with in the game, instead giving you the bare minimum items you would have needed to get to that point in the game. Which is shit.
This time it's not just my rose-tinted nostalgia glasses colouring my impressions of this port. Monkey Island fans across the globe all recognise that this port is basically shit, and it's widely regarded as the worst version of the game.
Avoid like the plague. Avoid like merely being in the same room as this game will make your sexual organs drop off, grow tiny legs, and scuttle away.
That game studio actually meant a lot to me growing up as a kid. I grew up in the days of PC gaming with Sierra being a big studio, but really it was LucasArts that meant the most to me. The first game I ever actually beat was the first Monkey Island game. I mean, that game right there, and along with everything else from the Scum engines, I mean, everything, you know, the Maniac Mansion games, Sam and Max, really one of my favorites. I mean, just a lot of stuff, especially in the early days of you know, LucasArts stuffs and the Scum engine especially. This one here is for LucasArts.
Finally, it's a port that I don't actually own the system to be able to play it on, but that's okay, because ScummVM has stepped in to fill the void.
ScummVM is a fantastic little program that lets you play any of LucasArts' adventure games, as well as adventure games from the likes of Revolution, AdventureSoft and a handful of other developers, on basically any system you can install it onto. Versions of ScummVM exist for Windows, Linux, the Mac, the Wii, the PSP, the iPhone, Android, Symbian, the Nintendo DS, basically everything.
It's the best way of playing LucasArts classic adventure games on your modern computer box, and the only way I have of playing the FM Towns version of Zak McKracken and the Alien Mindbenders, a game all about alien invasion and animal possession.
Released in 1988, a year after Maniac Mansion, Zak McKracken and the Alien Mindbenders took the basic formula of Maniac Mansion and expanded it. You control Zak McKracken, a writer for a tabloid called the National Inquisitor, subtle I know, who spends much of his time writing bollocks with little or no basis in reality.
He'd have made a great game journalist.
But Zack wants to break free of his tabloid hell and write something Pulitzer-worthy. Fortunately for him, or at least his writing career, he's been having weirdly prophetic dreams about alien worlds and novelty glasses. One thing leads to another, and before you know it, Zack is foiling an alien invasion. An invasion that involves a great big machine that's turning human beings into morons.
And that machine is called Tumblr. Actually, that was a joke. I was joking then. That was a joke.
In 1991, Zak McKracken was re-released exclusively in Japan for the FM Towns computer system, featuring radically enhanced graphics and audio. The new visuals are stunning, but do occasionally get in the way. For instance, it's much harder for a new player to see the unplugged television cord in the FM Town version than it is in other versions, but that minor flaw aside, it's actually pretty stunning.
The artwork really pops in this version, and the sound is exceptional. The music has been entirely redone in high quality instrumentation, and in some places they've even added new pieces of music for certain cutscenes like the opening sequence in the tabloid offices. They've also added ambient audio to some locations like Zack's apartment and public streets.
It's not as extensive as the Monkey Island special editions LucasArts put out in 2009 and 2010, but it's still pretty bloody spectacular.
This version was never released outside of Japan, and with FM Town's systems rather hard to come by, the only way you'll be able to play this game is in an emulator or using ScummVM like me. It's also exceptionally hard to get hold of a copy of this game, and if you do find one, you can expect to pay through the nose for it, but it's totally worth it. It's easily the best version of the game.
When I was 15, I was introduced to a game called Grim Fandango. And that was my first real foray into the non-educational adventure games, and I fell in love with it. I loved Grim Fandango. I've also gone and installed ScummVM on my computer so I can go back and play Maniac Mansion and Day of the Tentacle. And in addition to being just imaginative and well-written and funny, they're just great games, just gameplay-wise, and you know, the puzzles and everything about them are so much fun. I don't know why suddenly the adventure game market dried up, but this belief, this idea that there's no market for adventure games anymore is just simply not true. We've seen a ton of other adventure games come out since the heyday of the 90s that have also been really good. Although LucasArts may be gone, the people that made it what it was are still here. So while it's unfortunate, it's at the end of the day, it's a name, and we still have all of the people responsible for these amazing games, and they're fortunately still doing amazing things. So that gives me a little bit of solace knowing that.
And so that's it. LucasArts has been shuttered and their own adventure has come to an end. But it's not necessarily the end. See, Disney, who own Lucasfilm and all of its subsidiaries, have said the reason they shut down LucasArts is they want to focus more on licensing out the Lucas brands to external developers, and that probably means we're going to see more Star Wars and Indiana Jones titles in the coming years, but my hope is it means that they'll be interested in licensing out their other brands, like Monkey Island or Maniac Mansion or Full Throttle or, dare I dream, Grim Fandango. My hope is that Disney realizes what a fucking goldmine it is that they're sitting on. And if they're willing to milk the Star Wars franchise like they're planning on doing by knocking out a new movie every year from 2015 onwards, who's to say that this really is the end for Guybrush Threepwood and his digital chums? So, it might not be an ending at all. It might just be a brand new beginning. I mean, probably not, but still.